Good morning, all of you. So today we are going to see about the ICRP recommendations, International Commission on Radiological Protections. So first we will see the objective of these standards and organization. The objective is to explain the role of international organization and to present the main IAEA standards in the field of radiation safety. So IAEA is the International Atomic Energy Agency, which gives the regulations about the radiation safety. So in this we are going to see about ICRP recommendations. So these are some relevant international organization. First is the ICRP, International Commission on Radiological Protection, and which has established fundamental radiation protection principles and recommendations. So ICRU, another organization which is a sister body of ICRP, which gives the information about the radiation units and quantities. So UNSCR is also one of the international organization which is United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, which undertakes regular reviews of the current status on the human radiation environment, because we are using radiations for so many applications like in medicine, industry and research. But as of we know all that radiations are harmful, so we have to take up proper precautions before using any ionizing radiations for the application. So this UNSCR first take the status on the human radiation environment, and then knowledge of radiation effects and radiation risk. And whatever the analysis done by this UNSCR, it is the important information which gives for the ICRP to give the standard recommendations for safe use of radiation. So the function of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the international organization or agency under which other regional and national organizations are working. So the main aim of this Atomic Energy Agency is to verify the peaceful use of atomic energy, promoting safety, and then enabling the transfer of technology, establishing standards of safety and to provide for their applications, and facilitating the establishment of conventions. So other organizations include in these international standards: Food and Agricultural Organization, International Labour Organization, World Health Organization, Nuclear Energy Agency of the OECD, and Pan American Health Organization. So many organizations are working together to give the standards on radiation protection. So first of all, we see how this International Commission on Radiological Protection established. It is established by the International Congress of Radiology in 1928, and it formed as the International X-ray and Radium Protection Committee to address protection in medical radiology. So after Second War, after 1950, expanded to all aspects on radiation protection and given present name as a International Commission on Radiological Protection. So another is the ICRU. ICRU, which is formed in 1928, is a sister commission of ICRP, and which issues the recommendations on principles of radiation protection. So this forms the basis for more detailed regulations and guidance issued by national authorities, and recommendations and advice of ICRP are published on regular basis and made available as the annals of the ICRP, and it is recommendation and advice published in annals of the ICRP. So there are so many annals. After revision of every publication, they revise this publication and publish as the annals of ICRP. So the objective of this ICRP recommendation is provide appropriate standard of protection without unduly limiting beneficial practices that giving rise to radiation exposure. Means we have to focus on the benefits of radiation, and which unduly limiting beneficial practices that giving rise to overexposure to radiation. So we have to balance between the benefits of radiation, and we have to reduce the harmful effects of radiation exposure. So while running the practice of this with the help of this ionizing radiation, we have to focus on, we should get a maximum benefits from that application. So in 1950, first ICRP publication was published, and then in 1977 it is revised and published as a ICRP 26, and in 1991 ICRP publication 60 comes, and then in 2007 it is revised depending on the biological effects of ionizing radiation, and now it is published as a ICRP 103. So it is an ICRP is an independent registered charity which is established to advance the science of radiological protections for public benefit, in particular by providing recommendations and guidance on all aspects of protection against ionizing radiation. So this is the cosmic scheme of ICRP. So basic scientific studies which is provided by the scientific evaluations like UNSC and BER, and these biological or the analysis, whatever the analysis done, that information is provided to the ICRP recommendations, and these ICRP will tell the regional topical organizations, international safety standards and industry standards, ISO, IEC, and they form the national regulations. So primary aim of ICRP recommendations, so to contribute to an appropriate level of protection for people and the environment. So here we are using radiations, so which are very harmful, so we have to be take care of proper precautions to protect the people and the environment from harmful effects of this ionizing radiation. So during the early years of diagnostic radiology, a large number of severe exposures and accidents occurred. So a growing number of acute radiation exposure incidents led to recommendations on radiation protection in the international literature. So after the discovery of X-rays, they came to know about there are some radiations are present. We named it as a X for unknown X-rays, and they started using for to study the anatomical structures, and they were not knowing about these harmful effects also. So they started, but late effects were occurred like skin reactions, and they came to know that these radiations have some harmful effects if we cannot use in limits. So that's why after studying this background, they established this organization to study the safe use of radiations. So the ICRP was established in 1928 by the Second International Congress of Radiology. So we will see the ICRP recommendations. They were formulated in different areas of radiation protection, are based on current knowledge about the biological effects of ionizing radiation and revised on regular basis. So generally adopted by regulatory bodies and advisory agencies at national and international levels as the basis for the development of legislation, regulations, code of practice and guidelines. So this ICRP is a non-political organization, and its members are elected on the basis of all well-recognized work in radiation protection and related fields. So latest one, the 2007 recommendations of the International Commission on Radiological Protection, which is published as the Annals of the ICRP, publication 103, which we are going to see. And so the main objective, the general purpose of this radiation protection are to prevent detrimental effects such as erythema, cataract, to limit the probability of stochastic effects such as cancer and hereditary effects to levels deemed to be acceptable. So these to prevention and to limit the probability of stochastic effects, these are the main objectives of the ICRP recommendations. So we have to use these ionizing radiations very carefully to prevent the detrimental effects. Then these recommendations are these ICRP recommendations given the recommendation based on the situation of radiation exposure. There are three exposure situations are there: planned exposure situation, emergency exposure situation, and existing exposure situation. As a part of the system of protection, ICRP publication 103 defines three categories of exposure situations, namely planned exposure situation, which involves the deliberate introduction and operation of sources, situations where radiological protections can be planned in advance and exposures can be reasonably predicted, such as radiation therapy is one of the cancer treatment. In this, we are using highly ionizing radiations like X-rays, electron or gamma rays, and they are already planned exposures. Means everything is planned, and this much amount of exposure is going to happen, and what are the precautions we have to take. This everything is planned. So and the patient is getting benefit from that treatment. So we are using in a radiotherapy applications. Emergency exposure situations which requires urgent action in order to avoid or reduce undesirable consequences. So emergency exposure situations, like if something is going on with the help of this X-ray machines or some, and if sudden any emergency arrives, so that is emergency exposure situation. And in that case, what are the precautions or what are the consequences and what are the precautions we have to take, that is plan. An existing exposure situation which includes prolonged exposure situations after emergency, means once emergency came, the necessary actions we have to take, and to then situations that already exist when a decision on control has to be taken, and by adopting this approach in the principle, the ICRP system of protection should be able to be applied to any situations in radiation exposure. The potential exposures means in planned exposure situations, a certain level of exposure is reasonably expected to occur. However, higher exposures may arise following deviations from planned operating procedures, accidents including the loss of control of radiation sources and malevolent event. So such exposures are not planned to occur, although the situation is planned. Means here the treatment plan is done. So with the help of we are going to do radiation therapy, but in some cases some emergency will may arrive, and in that case what to do, that also it is planned. So we call it as a potential exposure. So these exposures are reported by the commission as potential exposure. So the ICRP recognizes three categories of exposed individuals. So like a situation based we have seen, now we are going to see about individuals who are going to expose in their field, and these categories of exposure are known as occupational exposure, public exposure and medical exposure. So occupational exposure is generally interpreted as a radiation exposure of individuals as a result of their work. So during their work they are getting some exposure to these ionizing radiations, so they falls under this occupational exposure. Medical exposure is predominantly that of patients, but also includes exposures incurred by those caring for patients. So medical exposure is solely for the patients, and in some cases there are patients so some neighbors or relatives who are going to take care of that patient, they also falls under this medical exposure, other than as a part of their occupation, and exposures incurred by volunteers as part of biomedical research program where there is no direct benefit to the volunteer. So we consider them as a medical exposure. And then public exposure, it incorporates all exposures other than medical and occupational exposures. They fall under this public exposure. So here they have, in this table we are going to see about occupational exposure, public exposure and medical exposure, how they are related to situations. So planned exposure situations, example is which comes under occupational exposure, working in a hospital, uranium mine or nuclear power plant, which is a planned one, also falls under occupational exposure as a exposure is related to their work or duty. And planned exposure situations in this public exposure is visiting a hospital, living near a nuclear power plant, this comes under public exposure. And in planned one, medical exposure like getting an X-ray, CT scan examinations and radiation therapy treatment, which is a planned one and falls under medical exposure. So existing exposure situations, in case of occupational exposure, it is aircrew and astronauts exposed to radiation from outer space. And in public exposure, like a radon gas in the home, and medical exposure is non-planned, so not applicable. Emergency exposure situations in the immediate response to an accident. In case of any accident, in the nuclear power plant or in any hospitals related to radiation falls under emergency exposure situation, and we consider it is under the occupational exposure. And public exposure during a major accidents. Suppose transportation of radioactive materials from one place to another. During that transportation, if any accident happens, this falls under emergency exposure situations and public exposure. So now we are going to see some three major fundamental principles of radiation protection. So justification, optimization of protection, and dose limitation. These are the fundamental principles of radiation protection, and how these principles of protection related with the situations, categories, applications, and dose criteria. This is the diagram which explains about how these principles of protection are related to each other. First of all, we are going to see justification. What is meant by justification? So any decision that alters the radiation exposure situation should do more good than harm. Means any decision that we are going to take related to radiation, from that practice we should get a more benefit than harm. So we have to justify first that we are getting a more benefit from this application or in this practice. It applies to all three exposure situations: planned one, emergency, and existing exposure situation. So the principles may have different wordings but are the same as a IEA publications. So no practice or source within a practice should be authorized unless the practice produces sufficient benefit to exposed individual or to society to offset the radiation harm and that it might cause. That is, the practice should be justified taking into account social, economic, and other relevant factors. So applicants for authorization of a new practice must provide sufficient evidence to the regulatory body of the benefits versus harms of the intended use of radiation sources. So first of all, we have to justify it that from this practice we are getting more benefit than harm. If with the help of evidences, then only the regulatory body will give the permission or license to run that practice. So the following practices are deemed to be not justified whenever they would result in an increase by the deliberate addition of radioactive substances or by activation in the activity of the associated commodities or products. So practice involving food, beverages, cosmetics, or any other commodity or product intended for ingestion, inhalation, or percutaneous intake by or application to a human being. So practice involving the frivolous use of radiation or radioactive substances in commodities or products such as toys and personal jewelry or adornments, and human imaging using radiation used as a form of art or publicity purposes. So next step is the optimization of radiation protection. So it requires the magnitude of individual doses, number of people exposed during that practice, and the likelihood of incurring exposures. So to obtain or to achieve this optimization process, it should be to be kept as low as reasonably achievable, means ALARA principle. So whatever the radiations we are using for benefits, that should be kept as low as reasonably achievable by taking into account social and economical factors. So the process should be constrained by restrictions on the doses to individuals, means dose consent we have to define, and the risks to individuals in the case of potential exposure. In case of potential exposure, any accident happens, in that case we have to set the risk constraints so as to limit the inequity likely to result from the inherent economic and social judgments. So this is the level of individual exposure, and so we have to apply your optimization ALARA principle to keep the radiations as low as reasonably achievable, below the constant level, and dose limits are set that above, if the radiation level exceeds a low dose limit, it is unacceptable, means the risk is more. So the constraints we have to set, and we have to optimize according to these constraints, so to keep these radiation levels as low as possible. Dose limits defines should be set to ensure that no individual faces an unacceptable risk in normal circumstances. Means we have decided we have to give this radiation treatment to this patient. So some dose limits are there while running any radiation therapy facility or any diagnostic radiology, that for radiation workers this much dose should not be exceeded. For general public this much limits. So we have to set the limits, because if it exceeds it is unacceptable. So we have to keep these radiation doses as low as reasonably achievable. So below this, below the acceptable level. Application of dose limits: the total dose to any individual from regulated source in planned exposure situation other than medical exposure of patient should not exceed the appropriate limits recommended by the commission. So all the dose limits are the same as in ICRP 60, except now the dose limits for lens of eye. Earlier they given some dose limits for some organs at risk, like sensitive organs like eye lens or parotid glands or spinal cord. Such doses they have defined in ICRP 60. Now it is revised in ICRP 103. Some sensitive organs are present, so their tissuing factor they have reduced depending on the biological effects of ionizing radiation. So dose limits are aimed at ensuring that no individual is exposed to radiation risks that are judged to be unacceptable, and it differs depending on whether the exposure to the workers or members of the public. If it is to the workers, the dose limits are higher, and if we consider normal or general public, if the dose limits to the public, it should be minimum, because it is not of their work and part of their work, and some small children included in that, so they are in growing phase, so they are more radio sensitive to the radiation. So we have to think about this while giving these dose limits to general public, and these dose limits do not apply to medical exposure, because here the issue is the intended result in terms of diagnosis or treatment of that patient. Means the patient is getting benefit from by using that radiation, so here dose limits are not applied. And persons working with radiation and members of the public who live or work near to the radiation sources must be protected to limit any unacceptable individual detriment. And this principle is achieved by prescribing individual dose limits for occupational exposure and for members of the public. And GSR Part 3 General Safety Report, they have given some dose limits. They have defined some dose limits. And so for potential hazards such as ionizing radiation, for which no safe threshold can be assumed for stochastic effects, and the choice of dose limits cannot be based solely on health considerations. So here we cannot say that this level is safe or a threshold value for stochastic effects. It may happen at very low doses and it may not be happened at a very high doses. So we cannot set a threshold for the stochastic effects. And the definition and choice of dose limit necessarily involves balancing health risk and social values. However, it must be emphasized that the limits do not define a dose limit below which there is a no risk, nor one which is deemed dangerous or life-threatening if exceeded. Means here is no do it there. So here there is such no limit that defines a dose where we are safe, and if it exceeds this level, we are in life-threatening situations. So there is a no demarcation line between the safe and unsafe. So there is not a demarcation line between safe and dangerous exposures, and are not necessarily the simplest and most effective tool in keeping doses low and ensuring the continuous improvement of the practice, and are not the sole measure of the effectiveness of radiation protection system. So exceeding the prescribed dose limit does not necessarily mean that there has been a breach of the national safety regulation. In some situations we can exceed the dose limits, but they aren't safe. The principles of justification and optimization applies universally to all three categories of exposures, like planned, emergency, and existing, whereas dose limits apply only to planned exposure situations. The exception to this is planned exposure situations involving medical exposure where dose limits do not apply, and in the absence of a dose limit, dose consents assume a particular importance. So, by the IEA safety standards, they have given some dose limits to general public and the occupational exposure, like a effective dose for occupational exposure for radiation worker is 20 millisievert per year, and for the general public it is 1 millisievert in a year. Equivalent dose to the lens of the eye, it is for 150 millisievert in a year for the occupational exposure, and for general public it is 15 millisievert in a year. And for equivalent dose to the skin, averaged over 1 square centimeter of skin regardless of the area exposed, it is 500 millisievert in a year for occupational exposure and 50 millisievert in a year for the public exposure. So in special circumstances, a higher value could be allowed in a single year, provided that the average over 5 years does not exceed 1 millisievert per year. So whatever the limits on effective dose and equivalent dose set by the international organization as a radiation protection point of view, so combined with optimization of protection are designed to avoid a risk of stochastic effects that would be considered intolerable in a planned exposure situation, and to limit or to prevent the occurrence of deterministic effects. So these are the two fundamental doses, like effective dose and equivalent dose, which gives about the avoid the risk of stochastic effects and to prevent the occurrence of determinist effects. Thank you.